seems like a world away, when we had Professor A.C. Grayling at Southside House talking to us about democracy and its crisis. Seems like an entirely different world. You know, so I'm just admit somebody as I go along. And I first saw Philip Collins in January of this year at an event in Barnes. And I was amazed at his ideas and, believe it or not, his clarity of thought. I don't want to put you under any pressure this evening, but that was certainly something. And also, like all good presenters, Philip left me and the audience wanting more. And I think that was the justification, if you like, of trying to invite Philip to come and speak to us. We wanted more of that good stuff. Now, Philip has worked in politics, you know, famously for Tony Blair. You're probably fed up with people saying that, are you?
No, not really.
You're okay, okay. Famously for Tony Blair, and also as a journalist, most recently with The Times. And I'm fascinated to hear what Philip's got to say. So with no more ado, I pass over to Philip Collins, and welcome to the Society.
Well, Mark, thank you very much. I'm glad you wanted more. That's very good to hear. And I'm delighted with the invitation to speak for as long as I want. You may regret that. I remember when I was working as a speechwriter for Tony Blair, I was often called upon to go and help out other members of the cabinet who weren't quite as clear or as concise as the Prime Minister himself. And there was one member of that cabinet who I'll only identify by saying that he was the Deputy Prime Minister and his name was John. And this John had a speech he was delivering, and I was asked to go along and have a look at it. And he gave me about a 10,000 word script that was veering all over the place. And I said, look, this is preposterous. It'll go on forever. What you need to do is you've got to just take sections and order them, and then tell us at the beginning how many points you're going to make, and then we know where we are within the speech. And he said, thanks, that's great advice. I'll definitely do that. And the next morning, he stood up before a very big crowd in Westminster Hall, and he said, good morning, everybody. I have 72 points to make. And the thing went on for about an hour and a half. So I am not going to do that. I'm not going to make 72 points. I'll speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then leave plenty of time for us to throw questions at me. And actually, for those of you who are accustomed to the chat on this technology, will have seen that Michael Collins asked me whether I'd happened to hear Mark Carney's Wreath lecture on Radio 4 this morning. And the answer is I did. And he touched on many of the questions, which is the connection between morality and markets and the way in which philosophy is embodied in politics and in economic life that I think are germane to what I'm going to talk about this evening. And in fact, I was reminded as I was listening to Mark Carney of his countryman, Michael Ignatieff, who wrote a very good book called Fire and Ashes, which I recommend to you, which was about his experience coming back from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard to be the candidate for the Liberal Party in Canada and eventually to become its leader. And Ignatieff presided over a catastrophe because the Liberal Party's fortunes collapsed, and the general election that followed, they won, I think, 2 seats, and they were completely thrashed by Stephen Harper's Conservative Party. And there were 2 interesting things there. Firstly was the idea of the philosopher in politics who struggled very badly to articulate something that was comprehensible to the ordinary people of Canada. And the other thing was a collapse in the mainstream center-left, and the idea that something very strange was taking place in the political firmament. There was a sort of early suggestion of a populism that was dispensing with the old parties. And you saw this pattern in Canada, you've seen it in France, you've seen it to some extent in Germany, you've seen it in the Brexit referendum, you've seen it with Trump, and you've certainly seen it in the more egregious and alarming examples of Hungary and Poland. And there was something of that in that book too. And he said the terrible thing about coming back from America to his home country of Canada was that how easy it was for a populist government in the form of Stephen Harper to portray Ignatieff, the intellectual, the member of the global elite, as in some way an enemy of the people. And this is the founding idea of populism. And this is what I want to talk about this evening, the populist challenge and what we can do about it, why it's come about, and whether or not we might have seen recently some glimmers of hope that we might be able to turn it back. And I think that all of us have an interest in turning back populists, no matter what our political affiliations. I think people of a good vintage conservative stamp also have an interest in the same thing as I do, coming from the centre left. And likewise, people who are more to the left than I am. I think that there's a tradition and an authority in democratic societies that we need to preserve. And I think the populist is a threat to that. So let me say what populism is. What do I mean by that? I mean by that a certain style of politics which has two aspects to it. One, the populist, and the obvious example here is Donald Trump, but the populist goes above the heads of the system to the people and proclaims himself, and it almost always is a himself, as the tribune of the people. The populist claims to have a direct line to popular sentiment. The populist will do that by saying that you, the people, have in some way been betrayed. You've been betrayed by an economic elite. You've been betrayed by a political elite. You've been betrayed by elites who have no interest in your good fortune and have been feathering their own nests. And the political system, you will say, is in some way corrupt. It has been stolen. Your birthright, your democratic rights have been taken from you by this elite, usually that shipped in from usually a global elite, and usually a highly wealthy elite, which is distant from you geographically and distant from you intellectually. And so politics, the populists will say, has been rigged against you. And this really is Donald Trump's election campaign. That's his mantra, that's his manifesto, that it's a fraud. People have been defrauded from what they are due. He had something of the same in the Brexit referendum campaign, where you get that sense of counterposing the elite to the people. And Mark Carney was a very good example of it. What better example could you have of the global elite than a Canadian governor of the Bank of England? Well, of course he's opposed to leaving the European Union. All the elites are. They're trying to pull the wool over your eyes again. And that's the idea that was fostered and pervaded by the Leave campaign. And it was very powerful. It was an extremely powerful argument. I don't say it like that in order to, in any way, really to denounce it. I'm trying to describe it. And I think it was immensely powerful and evocative, and almost always is. And the reason it's evocative now, the reason that this argument, which on the face of it usually would be regarded as slightly absurd and certainly very exaggerated, but the reason it's powerful now and potent is because for 30 years in the United States, the average worker has not seen a pay rise. For 15 years in the United Kingdom, the average worker has had no increase in their pay. And this is a fundamental political fact, which is new in our lifetimes. We have lived a life in which the political bargain in the developed democracies has essentially been that we, the political class, will promise you, the electorate, that your lives will get incrementally better over the course of our time in office. And we've more or less believed that promise because it's been more or less true, that for most of the time, the succeeding generations do better than the one that went before. And so we have been able to, at some level, think there is a bargain here. I'll vote for you, life will get better. If it doesn't, I'll vote you out. But there's a reasonable exchange there. And voting is never quite as transactional or instrumental as that. And it's certainly not like that for all people. But nevertheless, there's a very clear sense that of material progress. And the housing market is the most obvious drama of that progress in British life, because we politicize housing and we turn our homes not just into places we live, but into our principal investment, and we turn them into a sort of virtue signal in politics. And look what's happened in the housing market over the last 15 years, where young people, 30 and below, many of whom in really good jobs, will probably never, unless they've got a lot of parental help, be able to purchase their own home. Now, that is a fundamental change from my generation growing up, where even though I wasn't earning a lot of money and I had no parental income behind me at all, I was able to buy a flat in a nice part of London at the age of 23. Now, that isn't happening now. That is a really big change in the bargain which takes place within the society. So we've had a shift of rewards. And this is where it connects to what Mark Carney was saying, because underlying that is a huge structural change in the nature of our economies. The rewards that accrue to labor have declined over the last 30 years, and the rewards that accrue to capital, which is to say shareholders, have increased. Before 30 years ago, every increase in productivity was more equally shared in the sense that the workers got a reward for their increased productivity. Better work equaled better pay. The bargain was more or less honored. 30 years ago or so, that started to break down. And the work became less secure, and and yet that absence of security was not rewarded or compensated, as they say, with increased pay. So when people feel that they have in some way been dishonored or deprived, they're not wrong. There is a sense here they are onto something. So the root of the populist, although the answers the populist offers are ridiculous, there is at root a genuine problem that they are describing. And there's something about the nature of our economy which is broken, and our political system is not being able to fix it. Let me come on to the way that the politics have mapped onto that economic foundation. What's happened in our politics is we have, and this is particularly true in this country, we have developed political parties which have different philosophical traditions and also different sociological blocks. So the Labour Party was formed in 1900 literally to send the representatives of working men and women to Parliament. It's Clause 1 of the Labour Party constitution, which is much less well known than Clause 4, which defines its objectives in public ownership. But Clause 1 described the process by which the Labour Party would seek to win in Parliament. It's a clause demanding victory in Parliament, which doesn't fulfill very often. But that's what it was for. And it explicitly defines itself as a class-based party. The Conservative Party is less explicit about its class origins, but it's obvious from its vote that it has been that. It's very adaptable. It's changed. It's been the merchant party. It's been the landed party. It's been the party of the wealthy professional classes. But it was that for a long time. And the Liberal Party was also a landed party in the days when the franchise was very limited. But in the era of the universal franchise, really from 1928 onwards, you've had two large blocks against each other, essentially the working class bloc and essentially the middle class bloc. You always had a significant number of people who moved across, who were born into one bloc but voted in the other. Indeed, I'm the son of two parents of that kind. So there's always been plenty of people like that. But nevertheless, the bedrock vote of the two parties was quite established and was really quite unchanging. So much so that in 1951, if you were to ask of a voter in that election, what is your income? What is your occupational status? And what kind of housing do you live in? You will be able to predict with almost complete certainty how they voted. That's how clear it was. That very tight relationship between class origin and voting behavior began to break down from 1951 onwards, but slowly. It's slowly over the course of the latter part of the 20th century, that relationship started to decline. By the second decade of this century, it had almost gone. And in 2019 was the first general election where that information, your class origin, was of no value at all in predicting how you voted. So if I know your class origin now or your income status, I don't know anything that's going to help me predict how you vote. And indeed, things have flipped. The Conservative Party did better amongst the least well-off than the Labour Party in the 2019 election. So class voting has gone, it's dissolved. What it was replaced by has been, like it is in France, like it is in Germany, like it is in the United States, a form of sort of identity affiliation. So our values have become the things on which we vote. We've always had values, but we didn't vote on them, strangely enough. Whereas now we do. So if I were to ask in 2019 of any group of you, what do you think about immigration? What do you think about international cooperation? What do you think about feminism? What do you think about gay marriage? And I asked you a whole series of that kind of how we live now question. If you answered on the sort of liberal cosmopolitan side to all of them, I could say with almost complete certainty that you were a Remain voter. And you were very, very likely to be Labour, Liberal Democrat, or Green. Correspondingly, if you'd indicated that your preference was on the non-cosmopolitan side of all those questions, I would know with pretty much complete certainty that you voted either Conservative or UKIP, and you, without question, were a Leave voter. Because the two tribes were formed around Brexit. So we've got two tribes forming on an identity question, the question of national belonging, of national sovereignty, even though our politics is organized sociologically. We had three parties. We've got a Social Democratic Party, we've got a Conservative Party, and then a smaller Liberal Party. And they had some philosophical distinctions and a strong sociological distinction. And yet our politics suddenly has become organized tribally, according to identity. And this is why politics now is such a fundamental mess. It's because it was not devised for the circumstances we now have. And so that's why the populist has got an opening, because you've got an economic predicament, which gives you some purchase, and you've got a political system which is not answering the question which is being posed by the economy. And into that void steps the populist, either in the guise of Donald Trump, who then has to be contained by the American Constitution and does a very good job of trying to elude its constraints, or in the form of Boris Johnson, who manages to speak to enough people on the issue of Brexit to win a coalition and a victory of 80 seats, which is quite a significant victory. What Johnson has managed to do is to bring together a coalition of people who are into the Conservative fold, which has never really been assembled before, because it's some of the traditional Conservatives from the early 20th century, the Shire counties, the wealthier parts of rural Britain, though not wealthy urban Britain, interestingly enough, put together with the less wealthy parts of the perimeters of cities and the towns of the Midlands, the Northwest, and the Northeast. And those people who feel that the political system has not offered them much were responsive to the idea of Brexit because it seemed like a way of registering their disapproval. It's not that they had a strong view about the European Union as such. Most people didn't know anything about the European Union and aren't interested in it. But they did think, here's an opportunity to register my voice for me to be heard. And so they took that opportunity to do so. And Boris Johnson was able to channel that. So much as I don't like him a great deal as a figure, and much as I think his conduct of the twin crises of Brexit and the pandemic has been very poor, I have to concede that in strict political terms, he has some certain skill, because he is able to command an audience. And that's the primary skill of an electoral politician is, first of all, to get yourself into power. And he has been able to do that. And he's done that because he's the only British politician so far who's been able to straddle the new politics. He's been able to embody a new kind of political dispensation when most of the rest of them are stuck in the past. And that was what was wrong with Jeremy Corbyn's offer to the people. I mean, for my taste, he was too left-wing, but that doesn't really matter. Some people may like that. The really important point was that he was fighting the old style of politics. He was trying to win a Labour Party vote, which was a sociological class-based vote, at a point when that had disappeared. And Corbyn, I mean, to my mind, in a way, to his credit, didn't seem at all interested in the European Union. He didn't want to participate in the referendum, and he wanted to move on from it. And I slightly shared that point of view. And yet, politically, that was impossible because it was a defining issue. It was the prism through which all identity was being refracted. And a Labour Party which didn't have anything to say on that question was punished for it. Not in 2017, when people weren't quite ready to break, but in 2019, when Labour has its worst results since 1935. And so I think it's, although there's a lot to be said about whether Jeremy Corbyn was or was not a good leader of the Labour Party, I think it's always important to try and look beneath that and think, is there something bigger going on? So even if it had been a good leader of the Labour Party, I think they would have been contending with these forces anyway, and it would have been difficult for them to have been the Remain party and yet win a general election. So there's something deeper going on between the surface. And underneath all that, I want to come back to the Mark Carney point, which is the broken promise of politics. Because I think this is crucial. I think it takes us beyond the political system. In the book I've written, I've got lots of ideas about how we might reform the political system, because I do believe in electoral reform. I do believe in some constitutional changes. I am a sort of lukewarm Republican. I've got all sorts of things I want to change, and I want to change the tax system too. I think I want to redistribute wealth more. I want to tax things which are static, like land, and not tax income so much, and all kinds of radical liberal changes. In fact, the inheritance of most of what I'm arguing is a century old. It's the early 20th century radical liberals. And it was in America, it's Taft and Roosevelt. In Britain, it's Lloyd George and Asquith, who were really quite radical and quite not shy of using the power of the state to try and break up congealed power. But the economic aspect of this, which is where Mark Carney was talking this morning, is I think that the market economy, which is in many respects the most remarkable provider of prosperity and wealth and has lifted more people out of poverty than any other mechanism in the history of human life, nevertheless contains within it the capacity for power to congeal, for too much power to be gathered in small places. And I see no problem at all with a government saying there's too much power here, it needs to be broken up, which indeed is what American governments have always done. Because if you are a genuine believer in the power of competition, that's different from being a genuine believer in the power of the market economy. You have to intervene in order to preserve a competition. And if you've got companies like Facebook or Google or Amazon, which are now so dominant, then it seems to me perfectly legitimate to step in, if you can, to do something to reset that playing field and say this is no longer fair. I think this is particularly important in respect of those companies I mentioned, because they're not by any stretch of the imagination just private companies. What I mean by that is that politics used to be an obviously public event. It took place in the church hall, in the chapel hall. It then took place on the wireless. It then took place on the television. It took place in public. It was obvious and visible. Now, politics is also taking place in private, in the sense that highly targeted advertising is working through the filaments of technology companies, mostly Facebook, and is happening without being watched over. And we all know that our behavior is different when we're not watched over. And this is true of politics too. And so we've got this private space in which a public event, democracy, is taking place. And that's a really big change and very, very important. And so I have no compunction at all in taking public regulation into that space and saying you have no to declare it a private space, because it isn't, because a public event is taking place here and it's the public square, and therefore it needs to be watched over. And in making that claim, I would go back to the origins of the company. And again, this is Mark Carney territory, because if you go back to when the company began, the joint stock company flourished in the late 19th century in England, and it did so after the 1862 Joint Stock Companies Act. And that is a remarkable piece of legislation, and it's probably the only act of parliament about which there is a musical. In fact, there's an operetta by Gilbert and Sullivan called Utopia Limited, which I recommend you look up. My dad used to be in Gilbert and Sullivan, and I've seen it. And it is about, as improbable as it sounds, Utopia Limited is all about the 1862 Joint Stock Companies Act and about the creation of the company. And what that act did is it invents the laws of limited liability. It underwrites the risk that entrepreneurs are taken by the state, and it commits public money and public resources to the idea of risk-taking, for which there will be private gains. Now that is the origin of the idea of the public limited company. So companies are public from the beginning. There is no clear distinction between the public on the one hand, the private on the other. It's a merger from the start. So there's no compunction at all by saying there is a public role in the conduct of business and in what we do. It's not just at the end point of the process when we tax in order to procure public purposes. It's also in the way you do business. And if your business connects with public outcomes, as it does with, for example, your pollution, which produces climate change, or as it does in your private space in which public events are taking place, which are political, then the merger of the public and private is very important. And we need to change and reform our public systems to reflect that fact. So I think we've got an awful lot to do to change. But I promised I'd end on a note of optimism, and I will, because I have remained quite optimistic that the populist surge would be eventually turned back. Now, my optimism does not extend to countries like Hungary and Poland and Turkey, where in fact I'm gloomy and pessimistic that the not very well established democracies there are being snuffed out by really unscrupulous individuals who do have the capacity to override the constitutional checks and to cement their own power. So I'm not particularly optimistic about those countries. And my optimism is also pretty guarded with respect of France and some of the southern European nations, where although in France Emmanuel Macron has managed to hold off the extremists on either side, I do fear that once his term is up, that question has not gone away. So I'm not entirely certain that mainstream politics in France is particularly healthy. But my optimism, I'm in danger here of not sounding very optimistic at all. So I better get to the optimism which I do have, which is for the United States and for the United Kingdom. And it's a guarded optimism. It's not a sort of fond or naive optimism. But I do think that the deposition of President Trump and the election of President Biden is a very important moment, and it is a moment in which optimism is warranted briefly, because although the conditions which produce Trump, which are the conditions of populism that I set out at the beginning, are still there, and that's producing a whole slew of articles saying that Trumpism will survive after Trump is gone. To that extent, I agree that the underlying issues, the underlying economic and political issues, are absolutely still there. However, I don't think of that as Trumpism. I think of those as real, genuine political facts. I think Trumpism is a particular style and response to those facts, which is a politics which has no regard for the institutions and has no respect for the office. And I first noticed this with Trump way back in his first campaign to be president, when he was running against Hillary Clinton. And he went to Gettysburg to do a speech, a campaign speech. And Gettysburg, of course, is the site of Abraham Lincoln's great speech about the American Republic and his brilliant definition of American democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's also a cemetery where lie the dead of the American Civil War. It's the only site in the North that was a Civil War battleground. So there's a sanctity to the place. And it's as ever after Lincoln spoke there, it's been the place that American presidents go to pay their respects to the American ideal. And in some ways, it's a sentimental thing to do, but in another, it's a really important ritual that American presidents go there and they pay their respects to the idea of the people. And that's one of the ways in which politics is held to account. And so it's a fine and noble tradition. Trump went there, not as president, but as a candidate, which nobody else does. But he went there, and instead of doing the usual 2 minutes 32, which is what Lincoln took, of a paean of praise to American democracy, Trump did 45 minutes of a tirade against Hillary Clinton, who's a criminal who should be in jail, the American media is all fake news, and the American democracy is rigged anyway, and it's all a total fraud against you, the people. So he went to the site in which you're meant to praise American democracy, and he deliberately declared it to be a fraud. I thought, this is a man who respects none of the conventions, none of the rules here. He's going to play this differently. And so his departure means that even if the Republican Party does elect someone who has a slightly populist bent, I don't think they're going to be quite as egregious as Trump is, and quite as disrespectful of the office that he held. And I think with Joe Biden, there will be a return to something like the usual norms of American politics. He's a small c conservative man who will behave himself. And I don't think we should underestimate how important. But they're also about the everyday following of the rules. They're about norms and conventions and just doing it right day in, day out. And so to have someone who will not be making the news every other day because he's tweeted something ludicrous will feel quite different. So to that extent, I'm reasonably optimistic. I think then there's a big question for the Republican Party, which has to rediscover the virtues of conservatism. Now, I'm not a conservative myself, but I respect proper conservatism because it is about the preference for what is tried and tested, the preference for the familiar over the old. It is a absolute adherence to institutions, to ways of life that have been tested by time. There is a wisdom in conservatism, which I think the Republican Party has lost as it was taken over and trapped by Trump. So if the Republican Party can rediscover some of its old-fashioned conservatism, then elect somebody as its next presidential candidate who embodies that more noble view, at that point, American politics will start a little bit of a recovery. I say only a little bit because even if that happens, I think they do still have to address the underlying questions. I don't think they go away, which is why my optimism is only guarded, because all these things are surface level of politics, and underneath that surface lie these serious problems. So that's the real test for Biden, is can he make any progress on those problems? But it would at least be good to have a Republican Party which is in the conversation, not one which is trying to devise fictitious means of solving these problems. And then in Britain, I think we are just on the verge of moving past the Brexit conversation. I don't kid myself that Brexit is over when we leave the European Union, even if we get a deal this week, which I think we will, because of course Brexit only begins on the 1st of January. So it's by no means over. And of course the consequences for any business which is affected by it then start to kick in. So I'm not naively suggesting it's finished as an actual event. It's only just starting. But as a political event, it will cease to be as important, because the real toxic nature of it, and it has really ruined British politics for a long time now, will start to fade, because inevitably a government which has, in its own view, achieved Brexit will then move on to something else. It will then have to define itself by achieving something else. It's not going to be enough at the 2024 general election for Boris Johnson to say solely, I gave you Brexit. Now, and that's true even if Brexit has turned out to be okay in the meantime. It's still not going to be enough. There's too much time. He's going to have to achieve things. And here I come full circle to which is the coalition that Boris Johnson has. The people who voted Conservative to give him his place in Downing Street are a mixture of rural Conservatives who are quite wealthy and quite old, with urban Conservatives who are not at all wealthy, though they are also quite old. And they have very different interests. And he's got to find something to do for that latter group of people. Otherwise, I don't see that they will display any loyalty to the Conservative Party. It's a relatively recent vote for most of them. And the Brexit vote was a sort of gateway drug. Most people voted Brexit in 2016. A lot of them voted UKIP thereafter, and then they went to the Conservative Party, having come away from Labour. But there's no reason to suppose those people will be very loyal to the Tory Party if it turns out, in their estimation, the Tory Party is every bit as bad as everybody else in helping them. So underlying Boris Johnson's fortunes, as there is underlying the fortunes in the States, is the capacity of politics to address the deeper question. And the deeper question is that the average person is not getting any richer. And this is the first time we've experienced that in our lives. And it's that ability of democracy to deliver, which is in the dock here. David Runciman wrote a very good book called How Democracies End, in which he opens by saying democracies have two great virtues, which they advertise to their people. One is that you will get a certain amount of power and agency, not a great deal because there's millions of us, but a little power and agency coming through the idea of the people. And the second thing is you'll get material benefits. Life will get better in a democracy. It will get freer and it will get more prosperous. And the democracies of the established world have really not been redeeming those two promises. And that remains the task in politics for the President Biden and for Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And they don't have at their backs any longer the great sociological blocks that helped them into power before. So politics has become harder, it's become deeper, it's become more tribal, it's become much more difficult to accomplish. I don't envy them, but I do think that the high tide of populism that we saw in the last 3 years may finally have broken. And with that, I'll hand over to you for any thoughts or questions.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. Speakers, if you'd like to unmute yourself. But I would just wanted to start with, so well, that in a sense that's good. It's all good stuff. But what exactly would you change? Because I remember reading Start Again. You said, well, we should stop doing what we're doing. We need to reformat and do things differently. I mean, you talked about fragmentation of society, but we're still in a situation where we've got two main parties that don't represent in any meaningful way a large number of the population, large number of these tribes. So how would you change British politics?
Well, I think one very big change that would have enormous ramifications would be a change to the electoral system. So we have an electoral system which worked quite well when you had two big parties. It deliberately exaggerates the victory that a party wins, and it deliberately exaggerates the defeats that a party suffers. And as long as you keep swapping between them, you can live with that. It's unfair. There's no question about it. And it's certainly unfair for the third party, which gets squeezed in the middle. But its virtue, the thing that you gain at the price of unfairness, is strength. You gain clarity. You gain a government which can govern. And you counterpose this to the American experience, where very often you have a president who can't really do much because of the staggered system. So once upon a time, there was a sort of justification of the electoral system in the sense that it gave you strong executive government, that you could get on with things. That's really not working anymore. And Boris Johnson did manage to win a clear victory in 2019, but there hadn't been one, apart from that, since the last Blair victory in 2005. So we had 15 years of really quite unstable government where the electoral system isn't even producing strong governments. It's got all its unfairness still embodied within it, but it's not producing strong government. So I think the case for the current electoral system is declining. I think it's very poor. And I think the virtue of changing it will be to address the precise point you made, which is the number of people who don't feel represented. So there's two examples of this. So two traditions that are not mine, I don't like, but I do think it's wrong. There's no space within the system for them. So before we left the European Union, the European elections, I think UKIP won the votes of something like 6 million people. Now that's a lot of people to vote in a free election and get nothing. And they did get nothing. Now that's got to find its way through this. That has to be ventilated somewhere in the system. Now that frustration came out, I think, in the Brexit referendum. On the other side of the political spectrum, there's a significant minority of British people, and always has been, who are somewhat to the left of where I would like the Labour Party to sit. Now, those people don't particularly feel represented by a Labour government under the likes of Tony Blair. It's too right wing for them, but they've got nowhere to go. Now, briefly, they captured the Labour Party and they ran it under Jeremy Corbyn, and that proved to be a disadvantage enough of them to win the country. But that doesn't mean to say their views are just illegitimate and should be shut down and shouldn't have a place. Now, if one of the virtues of reforming our electoral system would be that we would then give more representation to smaller parties, there would be an incentive for the left of the Labour Party to break off on its own, to be a pure, properly left-wing party, and it would have some chance of winning some representation because it could do so in a proportional way. Likewise on the political right. And what that would mean is that for lots of us, you think, well, who shall I vote for? You end up voting tactically. I mean, where I live, as you know, in Barnes, I live as a Labour supporter in a seat which is a contest between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrat Party. So I make a tactical calculation. I end up never voting for the party I want to win because it doesn't make sense. Now, it would be better if I were able to just vote according to my values and my conscience. But lots of people are not doing that. Lots of votes are wasted too. I mean, my parents, who were Conservatives in South Yorkshire, I don't think they ever voted for the winner. So they never contributed to the outcome. So there's all sorts of defects in our system. And I think that if we had a system that was more representative, I think it would have quite a serious changes because the parties would change their nature as well. So at the moment, if you're a political strategist, and I know this because I've done it, it really doesn't make sense to spend much time campaigning in Liverpool. You're going to win anyway. And so when they say we feel neglected, it's because they are. There's no point just going up to Manchester because you're bound to win in Manchester. So ignore them. You take them for granted. And I'm making it sound deliberately stark, but this is what happens. The Tories, likewise, in the Shire counties, you put all your resources into the swing seats. And so you get this very targeted professional operation, which makes total sense. And you'd be mad not to do it, given you're just trying to win. But it does have the effect that lots of people, millions of people complain they never see a politician, even at election time. And that's because they don't, because no one's bothering with them. So I think that would change too, because suddenly you'd be having to try and win every single vote. Every vote would matter. And I therefore am a strong advocate of electoral reform. I always have been. And I think its consequences for the culture of our politics will be quite significant.
I don't know if anybody else would like to come in, but I mean, absolutely. But of course, there's two questions. I mean, one is how do you get that? And the other one is, of course, as we've seen in the US election, where I think Trump was elected with, there was 70,000 votes that meant that he got elected. And out of 350 million people. So that's not democracy as we know it. So yeah, I mean, I'm certainly we're all agreed about that, but it's very difficult to make it happen.
It is very difficult. It is very difficult indeed to make it happen because inevitably you always win on the current system, and then suddenly your appetite for changing it diminishes when you've been able to win. So it's very difficult to persuade. We have to persuade a government. I think the only candidates are the Labour Party. I think there might be a moment because of the thing I've been saying, which is that the tribes in which we're grouped now are not mapping onto our politics. It's very probable that the next election, it's going to be difficult for anybody to win that outright. So for the Labour Party to come back from the position they're currently in to win an overall majority in 2024 is a very long stretch, particularly as they can't seem to win back Scotland. So if Labour can't win back Scotland, and it doesn't look as though they will be able to, then they need to win a significant majority in England in order to win an overall majority. So they need to win in Somerset, for example. They need to knock out Jacob Rees-Mogg in Somerset, which is a really true blue Tory seat. So that shows you the scale of the task they've got. And therefore, it's probable that their only hope of ending up in government will be at the head of some kind of coalition government. That will involve the Liberal Democrats, and it may well involve the SNP. And that kind of coalition group might be able to gather around an idea of changing the electoral system. So although it is difficult, I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's non-feasible. I think in America, there's a serious problem because you're right. Trump's victory was incredibly narrow and he lost the popular vote and yet was able to win quite handsomely in the Electoral College. And that can't be right. I mean, there's something just basically wrong, isn't there? Where in a two-horse race, the person who gets fewer votes wins. I mean, that's got to be wrong. And the Electoral College is a real mess. I mean, fortunately, Biden won very comfortably. He's won by about 7 million in the popular vote. It's actually a very big victory, Biden's, which was obscured by the chronology of the way the votes come in. So anyone who knew American politics well saw the votes on the. I woke up on the Wednesday morning and I thought, oh, Biden's won. And so I did not have a week of wondering, oh no, it's close, it's a nightmare. I didn't have any of that at all. It was obvious to me Biden had won comfortably, just because where the votes were. But the college is a serious problem because it does throw into doubt a victory because of the way it's organized, which is otherwise quite comfortable. I think they need to reform that.
Philip, we have a question from Mike, your namesake, Michael Collins.
Yes, but as Philip would be the first to, I'm sure, wish me to say no relation.
Okay.
So this is not a put up, even though I also enjoyed listening to Mark Carney this morning. And in a way, my question, which is not particularly well thought, I'm afraid, kind of comes out from a remark of his, and I liked an awful lot of the ground he was covering, particularly the emphasis on values. He came out with a figure of 1 million people who contributed something to the NHS during the early part of lockdown. And so therefore my question kind of relates to representation in part and leadership as well. And it's sort of this. There's a lot of talk in your book as well, and I love the reference to Utopia Limited, all that kind of stuff, which is new and wonderful to me, and separately, Gilbert and Sullivan, yes. My question is really to do with the shift in work opportunities, partly the slightly despairing way in which all sorts of differently highly qualified people are now delivering things in vans, a la Ken Loach, and so on. I'm referring to the film, Sorry We Missed You, the follow-up by Daniel Blake and all the rest of it. So my question really is about representation and youth partly, and whether or not actually the existing processes and parties could ever really aspire to properly represent those sorts of people who are separately articulating what they want to articulate by volunteering to do NHS and the self-employed, huge numbers of self-employed. Sorry, a bit of a rant.
No, I know. I mean, you're right that we've got different types of organisations and different types of people from when the parties were first organised and embodied, and they are struggling to come to terms with this. Yeah. The Labour Party finds it very difficult. I mean, the Labour Party struggled with this before in the century. In 1959, there was a book called Must Labour Lose by Richard Rose and Mark Abrams, which set out the reasons that Labour had lost the 51, 55, 59 elections was they hadn't come to terms with the changing nature of a consumer society. So Labour was still acting as if it were 1945. And yet the prosperity of the post-war years had created a new class of people and new wants and new desires. And Labour was very slow to change and adapt to that. And I think something like that has happened again, in that the economy has fragmented. The large institutions have broken down into smaller units. Lots of people are working by themselves or in smaller companies, and lots of people are working in a non-corporate way. And because of the absence of employment rights, but it's also a political question: is who can represent those people. I think there's another dimension to that too, which is the trade union movement is not adapted to the changes that you are outlining. So one of the great disappointments I have is that the great voluntary organizations in the country are the trade unions. You know, the great voluntary associations is the trade union movement. Wonderful non-state collective bodies. And they have responded very slowly and badly to the changes in the economy. So the trade unions now, with the demise of manufacturing industry, are almost entirely public sector bodies. So all of the powerful trade unions are essentially arguing to government about government. we've got very poor union representation in some private sector parts of the economy, particularly amongst people who aren't part of a corporate entity. So I don't think we've adapted at all well in the way that our public representation connects to our changes in the economy. I think there's a big argument to be had there.
May I ask you a quick supplementary? Going back to Carney, it's about value.
Yeah.
So the next sentence or two that you might be saying relates to relative values, values of work, values of life, social contribution, and indeed representation, whether it's a trade union or a political party. What values are they representing? Or should they be representing?
Yeah, well, let's take the Conservative Party. What values does it represent now? It's really difficult to say, because historically the Conservative Party has represented sort of fiscal discipline and a sense of order and authority, and it's been very adaptable and changeable in its values, the Conservative Party, because sometimes it's a free market party, sometimes it's a protectionist party. But now, all of a sudden, it's sort of throwing money at things, and it's become a really different kind of party. So I think the question of what the values the Tory party stands for are up for debate. The Labour Party is a much more doctrinal party. The Labour Party is much more fixed and intellectually rigid. And it does profess to have a set of values, and it proclaims them all the time. The trouble the Labour Party finds is how do you embody those values in a way that simultaneously you're true to yourself, but you can also command a majority of the people. And the Labour Party has been a very, very unsuccessful enterprise for something which was invented to send working people to Parliament. And the Labour Party has won a decent majority in only 4 of them. Now that's not a good effort. And there's a great book by Edmund Dell, who was Harold Wilson's trade minister and the first chairman of Channel 4, former businessman and academic. It's called Strange Eventful History. And Dell makes the case, which I think is quite persuasive, that it is the constant proclamation of its values by the Labour Party which has contributed to its poor electoral performance. That there's a contradiction between what it proclaims and professes and what it wants to achieve. And that's a very troubling conclusion. And that, when we are allowed to meet properly, and you invite me back to the next session, I will talk about that, because that's the book I'm now writing. I'm doing a historical investigation into the Labour Party, why it wins and why it loses. So I'll very happily come back and talk more about that, hopefully somewhere in Wimbledon on the day when we're allowed to meet actual people rather than pictures of them.
That would be good. Do we have any more questions, people? David Marsh, you're normally a good chap for asking a question. Where's your question? Hello, David.
Good, yes. I'm sorry I didn't take part in the first hour because I was on another Zoom call. So you might have done this already, but I was rather struck by a couple of things that's happened with Keir Starmer in the last few days. The first one was listening to him on Desert Island Discs. He was remarkably good, I think. I think if anybody ever to have a chance of becoming Prime Minister, they've got to be on Desert Island Discs first, and they've got to choose a certain number of songs that I like, and I thought he did rather well on that basis. And then secondly, the anti-Semitism row, he doesn't seem to have really put that one firmly back in the bottle. It seems to be still flaming up, and he's in a really bad place there with the ghost of Jeremy Corbyn still stalking the House of Commons. So what do you think of Keir Starmer?
I have been quite impressed by Starmer so far. I feared he was definitely the person I wanted to win that election, that selection. So I was glad when he won. But my reservations about him were that he would be intellectually in the same place as Ed Miliband, and that might not be a very a viable victory position. So I feared he might
What
be...
do you mean, just too intellectual?
Too intellectual and a little bit, yeah, a bit too intellectual, a bit too remote, a bit too distant. And,
well, it does. I guess he was doing his best not to be that, wasn't he? He kept going on about how he'd been marching through East Molesley with a socialist party.
I also agree that
somebody obviously told him to do that.
Well, no, I think, well, I mean, I know him a bit and I know what he was choosing. And I know that genuinely he likes that music and he was quite relaxed and quite natural. And I agree with you that it does matter. You know, it's not a trivial point that he can be good on a program like that, because it demonstrates he has some sort of character. And that's an important component in politics. And one of the things that Johnson has got, whether we like it or not, is he has a definitely defined character, and people know who he is and they know what to expect from him. You know, in business terms, he has a brand, and Starmer doesn't yet have that because he's not as well known. But he demonstrated on that program that he was a thoughtful, nice person with a bit of a hinterland who liked music, and I thought he did well too. I thought he came across really nice.
And what about the anti-Semitism thing? I mean, is it inevitable that he's just not going to be able to do the right thing there because he's going to be too weak for some and too stringent for others?
I think he'll definitely, in the end, whatever he does, there will be people who don't like what he did. I've quite been impressed by how he dealt with it, because he's been emphatic, he's been decisive. He was decisive when Rebecca Long Bailey shared a post by Maxine Peake, which was, you know, inadvertently anti-Semitic, but was, and refused to apologize. And then Jeremy Corbyn really did fall into a peculiar trap, because in the response to the EHRC report on anti-Semitism, Keir Starmer made a statement which all the Labour MPs had seen beforehand. They knew it was coming. And in the statement said that anybody who denies that we've got a problem, who says it's exaggerated, is themselves contributing to that problem. He made it virtually impossible to keep anybody within the Labour Party who then criticised the report. Corbyn could have just, like everyone else did, just waited. He could have just said nothing. Instead, he came straight out with his statement and he landed himself right in trouble. And so Starmer was left with no alternative, really, but to suspend him. Now, the question comes, of course, you excite conflict when you do that, because Corbyn has a lot of supporters still within the Labour Party. But to the wider public, insofar as they care at all, it really does demonstrate that this is a party under new management, to use their own phrase. And it's a way of dramatising, we really are different, you know, we're not going to be like those people. It's been a bit of a mess.
But then he's stuck again, isn't he? Because he's now been, I mean, it's very minor rap over the knuckles, saying being deprived of the whip in the Labour Party in the Parliament. He's never taken the whip anyway, hasn't he? He's always been a rebel in his own party. He's never obeyed the whip. So that is such a weak sort of sanction. Maybe his hands were tied. He couldn't do anything about it. Well, I feel quite sorry for Keir Starmer.
I mean, that was bad. Then to let him back into the party is an error, in my view. And remarkably enough, the Labour Party is such a bureaucratic organisation that the leader doesn't decide whether or not Jeremy Corbyn can be a member or not. That was done by another committee. Now, that was an elementary failure of politics, because although the leader doesn't formally decide that sort of thing, what you ought to do is pack the committee and make sure it happens. And so he failed in his basic politics to do that. So that does look really bad, having taken the decision in the first place to then have to revert and then deprive him of the whip. It is a bit of a mess. I think you're right. And I think in the end, he has to emerge from this process having dealt with Corbyn, either getting an apology from Corbyn or a retraction that could perhaps put it to bed, and then that will quieten it down. Or I think he has no choice, given how far he's gone, to say, I'm sorry, Jeremy Corbyn cannot be a member of this party with his views on anti-Semitism as they stand. And then, of course, you're going to take a lot of flack from the Labour left, but you know, and judging strictly from the point of view of trying to win an election and no other reason, that's a better criticism to have of you than any other. So I think that's where he'll end up.
Philip, can I ask on that topic of leaders, why it is that the Liberal Party can't find a really strong leader, and even the Green Party? Why can't the Green Party establish itself? Because if you want proportional representation, surely what we need is lots of choice, lots of options. And it seems to me that what you're saying is correct about the Tory Party. They're brilliantly able to transform themselves by taking on board the values and policies of other smaller parties, and therefore preventing those parties from making any progress, from being different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've provided the best answer to your own question there at the end. In fact, I think that's exactly what happens. You see, what's your incentive to go into the Liberal Party at the moment? Well, you know, obviously, if you're a Liberal, that you've got an intellectual incentive. But what's your political incentive? Well, it's not enormous, because you think, well, I might as well try and liberalize one of the other parties and therefore have a chance and a shot at power, rather than be the leader of a small party. So electoral reform, strangely enough, would increase the incentive to be a Liberal and to be a Green. And so people who count themselves as quite green would then think it's worth my while being in the Green Party, even though I'm politically ambitious, because we can achieve representation and we can achieve things on our own terms. Whereas at the moment, if you believe climate change is the most important issue facing the country, where's the rational choice for you if you want a political career? Is it within the Green Party? I mean, arguably it is, but arguably it isn't, because arguably you'd be far better off being a very articulate Green voice within, for example, the Labour Party. So the system gives you incentives which force you away from those small parties. And that's one reason, I think, why they don't get the quality of leadership that the others sometimes get. Although, that said, you know, that some of the Liberal Democrat leaders have been pretty good. I mean, Paddy Ashdown was pretty impressive. Charles Kennedy was good in his way. I mean, Nick Clegg was perfectly good in a very conventional way. So they've had some good people, but the incentive for an ambitious young person in politics, because of the peculiar system we have, is to go to one of the two established parties.
You have got a journalist from the Telegraph newspaper, John Jones, who's unmuted himself. I don't know, John, whether you wanted to ask a question of your fellow journalist.
I enjoyed it immensely. I think I disagree with
We can't hear you. We can't hear you very well, John.
Hear me now?
Slightly better.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting talk. I think I disagreed with really all of it. I think just one aspect. I was curious that Phil, who called himself a broadly socialist, defending
John, we can't hear you very well. I don't know how to.
Maybe you could type it.
Yeah, maybe you could type. Could you type a question on the chat thing down the bottom? Because your microphone is distorting. You look very close to it. Right, there you are. Do you want to have another try, or to maybe type it?
I can't see that for the moment.
No, it's not working. It's not working.
In the meantime, Mark, Chris might like to ask.
Oh, lovely. Okay, right. Fire away, Chris.
Yes, thank you, Philip. It was a very interesting, intriguing discussion. I'm not sure I agreed with all of it, but I mean, that's the whole point. But I was interested in why you were so dismissive of the Electoral College in the United States. It seems that, you're understandable if you come from your perspective, dislike of popularism meant that Trump won once. But the Electoral College, the founding fathers in their wisdom set it up because the United States is not just a federal system, it's also a state system. The state governments are very powerful and have a lot, control a lot of people's lives. And the idea of the Electoral College is that the head of state of the United States of America will be chosen by all of the people who live in all of the territories. If you get rid of it, you will simply have the majority of people who live in California and New York imposing their views, as far as the head of state goes, on the rest of the country, which would be very, very, I would argue, schismatic.
I mean, I didn't mean to give the impression that I'd get rid of it. I'd say I think it needs to be reformed. But two things I think will need to happen with it. I do think it's a problem when you win a victory by quite a few votes in the Electoral College, as Trump did in 2016, but you lose the popular vote. I think there are two reforms that are needed to the Electoral College. I completely take your point about the Founding Fathers and the attempt to embody the different points in the system, in a federal system. Very important it is too. And in fact, their very purpose was to prevent what they called Caesarism, to prevent the kind of person like Trump emerging. And that has historically worked very well. The two reforms I'd like to see with the Electoral College is, firstly, the demographic shifts that have taken place since the Electoral College was established are enormous. So the weights that are attached to different states need to be changed because they're just out of date. And secondly, I would like it if more states took the lead of Maine and Nebraska. And instead of having a winner takes all, they attributed their votes in the Electoral College according to the weights of votes in their state. So then, for example, not if you won Pennsylvania by a hair's breadth, you'd get just over half the Electoral College votes rather than all of them. And I think that is a peculiarity in the system. Not by no means only a peculiarity in the American system, but those two reforms, a reallocation of the weighting and then allocation of the Electoral College votes according to the number of actual votes, would then move the Electoral College back into alignment with the popular vote and where they live, and I think would then fulfill the original function of the Founding Fathers better than the way it works today. So it's really just a practical point about how it's working. I'm not opposed to its very existence.
Yes, but surely when it was set up, most of the people lived on the coast. So there's always been this imbalance. It was set up specifically to give the voice for all of the territory electing the head of state. And so what you're doing with your first reform is disrupting the way that will lead all the states who then feel that they can never have a president of their own choice, will lead them to, well, could lead to possible schism. That was why it was set up by the Founding Fathers. It's not a popular vote. It reflects the fact that you have to look at the wishes of all the people who live in all of the territories, not a popular vote.
No, it's an attempt to balance the popular vote with that consideration. So it's against the popular vote. It's an attempt to get both of those things together in one go. And I think the changes have been so big. I think some of the imbalances now are vastly bigger than they were then. And that's just the weight which attaches to a vote in some states is now so much bigger than it is in others that there's a fundamental unfairness has been built into that. And that now, I'm pretty sure there's no right answer here. We're trying to balance competing imperatives. So it's not one or the other, so therefore it's a judgment about when you go too far. It's not a straightforward question, but I do think that shift has gone too much, and the gap and the difference in the weights now from what it was when it was began is greater. And so I would alter that.
One final go on that. You are, if you do, you are moving it towards a popular vote. So you might as well get rid of the Electoral College.
No, it doesn't follow that you should get rid of something if you're going a little bit in one other direction. Because you're suggesting because I want to go a little bit over there, I'm forced to go all the way over there. And I'm not saying that at all. No, we don't. As I say, it's an attempt to balance competing objectives, not the triumph of one over the other. And so all I'm suggesting is a tweak. I'm not suggesting an enormous change from where we are now. It's only a little, and I'm prepared to trade lots of it. So I'm recognizing the competing objectives, and I'm certainly not abolishing the competition of objectives and replacing them with a popular vote. I just think the balance is wrong.
Can I ask about fake news in that context? Because from my own point of view, I thought the US election was fabulously entertaining, and it's a great shame, and it puts British politics to shame in the sense that it was it was just so interesting, clearly there's some big issues there. But I mean, the issue of fake news is in there big time. And particularly your point about Facebook targeting individual small groups of people in places where you can win a lot of Electoral College votes by influencing a small number of people.
Yeah. And our capacity to do that now is greater than it's ever been. The technology exists that we can then reach the relevant people and very rapidly, and that's never been true before. Now, we shouldn't lament that fact, because what's wrong with that? As long as the information is clear and true and right, the fact that political parties can reach lots of people is a good thing. You know, this could be an increase in the information available to the electorate upon which they can make a decision. So I don't lament that fact, because I don't want to be one of those people who doesn't trust the people to make up their minds. So I don't buy the idea that elections are simply won by media people. I just don't buy this idea. I think it's deeply patronizing to people to think that they can't make up their minds. So I don't think people are defrauded. Like literally untrue lies are being fed, then of course people are being tricked. And in that sense, then obviously this is something we need to be very, very scrupulous about. And that is happening at times, and conspiracy theories are circulating very rapidly. And the regulation of political advertising needs to be tighter. And anything which there's no reason why when a political party puts something through a Facebook account, it shouldn't have to be declared as a matter of course, as it would be if it were in the newspaper or if it were on television. And we've just become accustomed in the infancy of this new technology to thinking that the same rules shouldn't apply. But some version of the same rules must apply. Otherwise, we will get nonsense circulating. And the scope of the internet is so big that it's virtually impossible to police in quite the same way. So it's really hard to stop nonsense spreading, but we have to do what we can through the regulatory apparatus to ensure that what we do see that has the title on it of a political party is verified and upholds the standards of truth that would be required if you were doing a television interview.
Could I just come in on that, please, Phil, with the forbearance of Mark? Because it seems to me one very positive thing about the US in the last couple of weeks has been, despite all this fake news and despite Mr. Trump going on about having all this fraud, nobody else in the Republican Party, not least people like Mr. Barr, or the Attorney General, nobody's backed him up on that. So even though we've got the social media peddling all these untruths, and even though we've got clearly a mentally deranged president, it doesn't seem to have actually made much difference to the transition of power so far, at least.
I agree with that. I agree. I think that, broadly speaking, the truth has prevailed in this election. And there are lots of instances of where it hasn't, but broadly speaking, it has. I think broadly speaking, the Constitution has held up. And the delicate balance that we were talking about before in the previous answer, the Constitution designed to stop power being congealed in any one place, has basically held up. Trump has tested it and it's won. And the election will produce an outcome which is a change of government. And I think it was very notable today. You mentioned Anthony Barr, the Attorney General, who has been, in most respects, a pretty alarming Attorney General. Today was quite clear that he didn't back Trump in his more outlandish claims of fraud. And apart from a few outliers like Rudy Giuliani, the Republican Party seems to be gradually moving away from the claims of Donald Trump, and Trump is slowly giving up. So I think in the end, that's why I did have a little bit of cautious optimism, because I do agree, David, in the end that there still is a truth value in politics. There still is truth value in public life. It does still matter. And broadly speaking, in the contest between truth and falsehood, truth was, 2-1 up.
Good. Do we have any more questions for Philip? If not, I think we could probably let you escape off. Let you off.
Well, maybe if I could just put one more. I know you were mentioning Tony Blair. How will Tony Blair go down in history? I've got this book by Tom Bowyer, Broken Vows, and then I've not got the new one he's written about Boris Johnson, where he seems to have given Boris Johnson quite an easy ride. Yeah. People have got it in for Blair, haven't they? They really have. People tend to look on the black side of Blair, whereas mostly they probably won't about Boris Johnson for various reasons. Is it because he was too young, too good looking, too Bambi-like? He peaked too early. he lied over Iraq. You know, why is it that he'll go down as a pretty tragic figure in British history,
well,
or will he?
Well, I think in the longer run of history, he probably won't, but in our lifetimes, he will. And the short answer is Iraq. I mean, the reason is the Iraq War. There's nothing else. I think that the things that we will remember in the medium term will be Northern Ireland, where in the credit side of the ledger, along with John Major, but the achievement of peace in Northern Ireland is a significant political legacy. I think you can look at the public realm, the rebuilding of, and the improvements in education and health service, I think were significant in the Labour years. There's a little bit of a constitutional legacy, not that Blair cared about it very much, but devolution, whether for good or ill, was something that was done in those years. And also, a little known aspect is that the Blair governments achieved some fairly conventional social democratic objectives, which was that they redistributed a lot of income. Now, during the Blair years, capitalism became more unequal in the sense that the untreated outcome of market relations were highly unequal. The action of the state during those years was to redress that inequality somewhat. And the net effect of that increase in market differentials and that closing down of the inequalities through state action was for there to be essentially no change over the 13 years. So inequality was flat for 13 years. Had there not been government action, it would have increased very significantly. So you had a tempering of essentially what's happening was a greater return to skills. We were producing an economic inequality, and the government collapsed that and broke that down. So although that's a sort of invisible achievement, I do think it's an achievement. All of which is lost in the discussion, really, because of foreign policy and very particularly the Iraq War and the controversy surrounding that. And I think that Blair's reputation in the medium term will never really escape the consequences of Iraq. And that's in the fullness of time, by which I mean 50 years, 100 years, of course, most things are forgotten and only a few things loom large and remain. And we'll see what happens. But I think the Iraq War is really the short answer to why.
Well, that will be for the new generation of the Philosophical Society to dwell upon.
Yes, they should. It will be very interesting to see. And the Iraq War is a constantly recurring question, and people, of course, always assume that they assume two things. One that there was a series of lies were told, and the second is that Britain simply followed America into the war. I mean, the consequence of the second point, of course, is if that were true, then, well, the war was going to happen anyway, wasn't it? So Britain's involvement didn't make the war. There was going to be a war because the Americans were going to war. So the consequences were going to happen anyway. The question is, were we involved? And on that, Blair was much more sure than Bush. Now, Blair was, whether rightly or wrongly, absolutely convinced of the case for an intervention in the war. He was in no sense simply dragged along by America. He did that with us. He understood it's a good thing for Britain to generally agree with its main ally, but that's not the reason he did it. It's worse than that. He really believed in it, genuinely, thoroughly believed in it. And the case about the alleged lies is that, if you just think about that, it's a rather bizarre accusation, is that let's imagine that I know for a fact there are no weapons of mass destruction. I know this already. Am I really going to make that my case in the knowledge I'm going to be found out? Of course I'm not. So the intelligence was really hopelessly wrong. I think the really proper case against Blair in the Iraq War is not that he lied, which is actually a rather stupid accusation. It's that the case was so exaggerated and the degree of certainty that he attached to the intelligence was not warranted by the caveats that were placed upon it in the reports. So it was an exaggeration. It was a willingness to believe everything which confirmed his view and being uncritical about things which didn't confirm his view. That's what actually he did. So that's culpable, and that's poor judgment, and that's a lot of other things, but it's not quite the same. And it's more sophisticated critique, in fact, than saying, oh, they just told a load of lies. So that's what the error, I think, if it was an error, and I think it was, and I thought it was at the time. And I think that will dominate the legacy for the foreseeable future, sadly.
Very good, very good. Well, if you're all done, ladies and gentlemen, we'll let Philip go. I know he's been very busy on Zoom. I'm very interested in the what you were saying at the beginning about populism and about tribes and about values and about broken promises. So, you volunteered to come back and tell us about that when life returns to normal after COVID-19. So you are most welcome to come back. So I would like to thank you for this evening. I would also like to thank all of the members who contributed as well. Thank you for joining us. Sorry about the technical glitch at the beginning, but if you could join me in thanking Philip for coming, and I'll wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I wish you all a very happy Christmas and look forward to seeing you all in 2021.
Yeah, see you, Bob.
See you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Very kind of you. Very
You're
kind.
welcome.
Much appreciated.
Thanks very much.
Bye.